Ethan and David, where are you guys calling from?
I am on what I like to call the east coast of Iowa, just on the Mississippi River.
What like are you close to like Davenport or like where are you actually?
Yeah, I live in a town called West Liberty. It's about 20 miles east of Iowa City, in between Iowa City and the Quad Cities, Davenport, etc.
Yeah. Okay. As an ELCA pastor, I have a bunch of friends in Iowa.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah. Can y'all hear me okay?
We can hear you, David. Yep.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I'm in Vance County, North Carolina. We live out in the woods now and up about 5 miles from the Virginia border. I'm a retired, I guess co-vocational is the best term for me, minister. But I retired several years ago and but have always been an advocate probably since the 80s of the term we liked to use in Presbyterian Church was tent making ministry. And I was a tent maker since then. But I've corresponded with Eric. It's sort of a losing battle in the Presbyterian Church. They haven't quite got that yet. So
Yeah. David and I have a special relationship because David gave me a bunch of his old books.
yeah.
You called me like, I got like a bunch of books on tent making, bivocational ministry. Do you want them? I don't need them anymore. I was like, yeah, bring them on. So added to my library.
Yeah.
So that is my love language. Give me your old books.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. And Darian, where are you calling from?
Calling from Charleston, South Carolina.
Nice, nice, nice. Charleston, beautiful place. And hey Nick, where are you calling from, brother?
Hey guys, I'm currently in Orlando, Florida. I'm
Okay.
from Memphis, Tennessee originally, but I'm just here for a conference right now.
Nice, nice. Very cool.
Mhm.
Very cool. I love it. Love it. And Mike, where's home for you? Where are you calling from? Oh, I don't know if you're there, Mike. So we're looking for the audio.
My bad. Say it again.
Where are you from? Where are you calling from, brother?
From my bedroom in Indianapolis, East Side all day.
Okay, awesome. I just drove through Indy. I forgot that you were in Indy. I should have gave you a call. I drove from
yeah.
Pennsylvania to St. Louis and passed through Indy. Next
Yeah,
time I'm
yeah,
there,
next
it's a
time.
great city. So awesome. Well, let's go ahead and jump in, shall we, fellas? I'm sure some other folks will join us. Oh, there's Pastor Bongo. He has the longest commute. He's coming from South Africa, so grateful to have an international presence tonight. So I have Brad, Steve, and Rob. Got some questions. We're going to get through the first hour, and then we're going to open up to the floor the second hour. Just want to real quick put it out there. If you don't want to be on video during the recording that will go on YouTube later, you can put yourself off camera for now, and then I'll stop the recording during the second half. But tonight's conversation, it's all about developing the next generation of church leaders. So before we get kind of too deep into the weeds, Brad, Steve, Rob, I'd love for you all to first introduce yourselves, kind of who you are, what's your ministry, and share like your ministry origin story, if you will. My kids are into Spider-Man right now, so I'm all into origin stories. And like, what were the circumstances that brought you into ministry? All right, so Rob, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. I am a boring Lutheran pastor at a boring Lutheran church in Pennsylvania. Uh, and I didn't think I was boring, but then Eric said so on a podcast when he says is the way, the truth, and almost the life. So, but no, it's we're in a little kind of exurb, and that thinks it's a small town, but isn't. And my origins, my dad is a pastor, and there's so much that I learned from him. A lot about preaching, just listening to a lot of good preaching. Also, he told me before I went to seminary that I needed to go to the real world and work. And that was really some of the best advice that I've ever been given. My father-in-law is also a pastor. And I learned a lot from preaching from him, as well as some Lutheran theology that he really helped clarify. And then my wife is a deacon in the Lutheran church. And I would say from her, I learned how to pray, or I'm still learning how to pray from her. So I would say there's a lot of others. It took a village, but my dad, my father-in-law and my wife have really been sort of crucial. Also add in there some time in Germany and in New York City in really secular environments, recognizing the church was not a given in society, kind of also really formed and crystallized some of my sense of a call.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob. Brad, same question. What's your story and
Yeah.
what's your origin story in ministry?
So for about 25 years, I worked for an organization called the North American Mission Board. Specifically, the church planting arm of that group is called the SEND Network. So I was a church planting catalyst in Kansas City for 17 or 18 years. It just means I helped to recruit and train and resource and coach church planters. And then in the last 6 or 7 years, I've had different roles, but primarily working with bivocational and co-vocational church planters kind of across the country in Canada. Background is I was actually in the restaurant business with my brother for 13 years. And in the midst of that, we both became Christians. And it's interesting, every single conversation I had with leaders in the church told me that if I was serious about ministry, we needed to sell our secular business and I needed to go to seminary. So that's what I did. Where now I love talking to church leaders that are in the business world. And I like to tell them, you don't have to choose, actually. So, but I just felt like the Lord was wanting to use my entrepreneurial spirit for church planting, and we planted a church about 30 years ago, and then that kind of just led into all these different roles I've had over the last probably 25 years, and all relating to church planting on some front.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Never knew that you were in the restaurant industry prior to getting into full-time ministry. That's really interesting. You probably learned a lot in those years about people and leading teams and all that good stuff. Awesome. What about you, Steve? What's your story and what's your origin story in ministry?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, okay, I'll try to be fast. Church planter, parent church pastor, regional church planning leader for a denomination, national church planning leader for a denomination. And then I became an urban church planning nerd. And now I'm a 21st century church planning nerd, leading a couple of organizations, Urban Islands Project and Next Wave Community. And we're helping new churches start in healthy ways in hard places and help existing churches transition to the 21st century culture. My origin story goes back to a guy named Dave Klein, who was my youth pastor when I was a kid growing up. And he would let me come over. My parents were Christians, but they were university professors. And so I didn't come from a ministry church background. But Dave Klein brought me into his home, answered questions, asked questions, fed me a lot of food, gave me chances to do stuff. And then another guy named Chuck Schumacher, kind of simultaneously, I met him playing a pickup basketball game. Later on, figured out he was actually there on purpose making disciples. I just didn't realize what was going on. And he invited me to this secret invitation only Bible study, which was absolutely fascinating to me. He's like, got to go check this out. And that's where I really, really became a follower of Jesus, even though I was part of a great church and I had a great youth pastor. It was like all that stuff. And that really formed and shaped me in a big way. And later on found myself at a pickup basketball game making disciples because I learned that from Chuck. So that's kind of my origin story.
I love it. I love it. There's a common theme in all of these. With Rob, it was New York City and Germany and the marketplace. Brad, it was the restaurant industry. Steve, it was the basketball court. All these places that were outside of the four walls of the church that formed us, which is pretty interesting to see that common thread. So the next question I have is kind of the theme of tonight's Covo Con is, well, it has a lot of names. The clergy shortage in America, the empty pulpit crisis, the graying of the American pastor. One data point I found from Barna that was very interesting. It said that there are more full-time lead pastors in America over 65 than there are full-time lead pastors in America under 40. So, with all that excitement to kick off this evening, what are you seeing in your circles when it comes to the next generation of leaders and developing leaders? And let me just caveat here. I don't mean the next generation as they have to be 25. It could be someone who is older, and that's okay too. But in terms of developing leadership pipelines, what are you seeing in your circles? Let's start with you, Brad, for this one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, I would say, yeah, my world is primarily church, working with church planters, and and I would say the majority of them are younger. And man, there are a couple of themes I see consistently with younger leaders. First one I would say is, to me, it seems like most, and I work primarily with guys, but most younger men, frankly, they don't want to be the dude. Like, they don't want to be the CEO of an organization. Like, when I planted a church, it was all about, like, CEO kind of leadership, single, highly gifted leader. And I just see younger leaders, they're not interested in that. And I think there's several things that are going on. First, I would say they've seen the struggles and challenges of leadership and kind of the prevailing model of church. I mean, conflict and burnout, you might even call it quality of life. They just seen it's just not a desirable calling. I mean, the examples that they've seen, I mean, not that it's not a desirable calling, but the examples they've seen of leadership in the church, it's like they don't want a part of that. Related to that, I would say, is they really value community, they value team. So it's like they want to plant, but they want to do it with a team. They want to do it in community. And then the other thing I think is interesting in light of this conversation, I think, Eric, younger generation, at least the guys I work with and talk to, they don't want to have a single vocation. Like, it's just natural for them to have multiple side hustles. It's just a natural way of life. And my kids are that way. I have a 30-year-old son and a 25-year-old son, and both of them, they're doing like multiple jobs, and it's like that's the way they want it. So I just think we just have to think differently. Unlike myself and certainly my father's generation, they would go and get an education for one vocation that they would do. My father had the same job for 45 years in the same company. Younger generation of leaders, I just don't see them thinking that way. They like flexibility, like innovation. They like, kind of moving in and out of different callings or vocations. So I just think we have to be mindful of that especially when we think of church leadership, that it's not this single soul kind of CEO type of leadership. That's just not appealing to them.
Wow, that's really good. Thanks for sharing that, Brad. What are you seeing in your circle, Steve?
Yeah, wow, I agree with you, Eric. That was great insight, Brad. I'll come at it from a little different angle. What I'm seeing is people that have leadership potential in the church are struggling with the current state of the evangelical church. They don't want to be associated with a religious expression that they perceive to be in the process of being hijacked by some kind of political agenda. And they don't want to be part of just go watch a show or go through the motions of church rituals. They want to be part of something real, but they do get energized with the idea of Jesus in real life. That they want to be part of that, and they're trying to figure out what that means. And they want Jesus to be part of their whole life, not just what they do sitting in a church. So what I mean by Jesus in real life is I saw this. I spoke at a Christian university and gave this what I thought was just a spectacular invitation to church planting and made the case for it, the whole 9 yards, and basically got zero response. Like, I gave sort of an altar call kind of a thing, and nobody said, yeah, I want to go plant a church. And so I was really baffled by that. So I went down and I started talking to some of the kids. I said, so, what's going on? You guys don't seem to be interested in the church. No, we don't want to plant a church. I said, well, what do you want to do? What do you feel like you're supposed to do? And they said, well, here's what we want to do is we want to move into a neighborhood. We want to become friends with our neighbors and help them follow Jesus. And I said, well, that's a church. And they said, no, that's not. So I feel like one of the challenges, like why people are not stepping up and saying, I want to plant a church or I want to lead a church. Part of that is maybe we have an understanding gap, an expectation mismatch, and it's contributing to lower numbers of people showing interest in church leadership roles because they think their only option is a church as usual as they've seen it. And whether it's a new church or an existing church, they think we're going to cram them into this mold that they don't want to fit into. And so I think that's part of the challenge that we're seeing in terms of declining numbers. I think also the interesting thing is my age group, I'm 67 right now. And basically I'm the average age of pastors has followed me my whole life. Like I've always been the average age of pastors. So that's a little scary to me that now the average age is around 67-ish or something like that, depending on who you ask. I think that's part of what I just described, and some of the things that Brad described are some of the reasons why younger people, we don't have more younger people stepping up to be involved in ministry leadership.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And to be fair, you're a very young 67-year-old, Steve. You're out on your bike, you're exercising, like you really keep yourself healthy. I like that about you. Very Colorado vibes. What about for you?
Thank you, Eric.
Of course.
I'll have to give a contribution to something.
Yes, please do. What about you, Rob? What are you seeing in your circles when it comes to the clergy shortage in America?
Sure. Well, David had mentioned, or in the sort of prequel, as we were warming up, that he's sort of seen the Presbyterian Church not willing to negotiate or navigate sort of the changing situation. I'd actually say, as somebody who's in a very mainline-ish denomination, I'm seeing a total collapse of the pastor church market. And what's happening is that there's such a shortage right now that it's forcing our denomination, which has a very clerical sense, super academic tradition, like it just can't be sustained. And so, like before our very eyes, like there's almost becoming like major league, AAA, AA, and single A kind of tiers of sort of guild members anymore, who's in and who's out. It's really, and it's on the one hand kind of exciting to see the Holy Spirit like breaking down a clericism in our denomination. Um, on the other hand, there's a lot of grief, just a lot of grief, myself included. I would also say that like 20 years ago, I sort of had like mainline, I had sort of had like, I was like a mainline person, kind of jealous of the evangelical church because like so cool and so young and so hip. And like, I was like, I don't like liturgy anymore. Like, I want to be like an evangelical. And what I'm seeing is that sort of like things are kind of arcing back. And now we're having a ton of people who are entering into my congregation who are coming out of an evangelical tradition, but they don't want the politics and they're curious about liturgy and they want something that's deeper than their pastor. Like they want to tap into the great tradition, capital G, capital T, and they're hungry for that. But then they get into our denomination and they're really scared because our denominational leaders have so sort of oriented themselves around liberal social politics that they're like, whoa, 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 I just came from like crazy religious conservative politics. I don't want to go to like crazy liberal politics either. So I think there's a question of how many of these sort of ex-evangelicals, as they migrate into mainline systems, how many of them will actually want to pursue ordination, and how many of them will just find local churches that are doing like good ministry, and just those pastors and those people will just start doing the kind of stuff you're talking about, the parachurch ministries. So again, I sense the Spirit's doing something in deconstruction, but I don't necessarily know what the new kind of formation of that looks like.
Wow, that's really good and really fascinating. Thanks so much, Rob, for that perspective. There's denominational leaders, network leaders that seminary professors and deans that will watch this recording or are on the call right now. And there are some things I think we got right, and we are getting right in terms of training and developing pastors and ministry leaders. So I want you guys to think of something that's like this facet of developing ministers has to stay. But there's also some things that's like that needs to die. That's just it's irrelevant, it's outdated, it needs to go. So Steve, and when you're working with leaders and denominations and networks and seminaries, what's something that you're like, hang on to this because this matters, and what's the thing that you're like that needs to get thrown in the trash?
Yeah,
just pick one, Steve.
yeah. That's such a great question, Eric. And that, you always say that when you're trying to think of what to answer, you say that's a great question. Stalling for time. No, you did kind of give us a heads up on this. Thought about this a little bit, and I would say what seminaries and religious training, whatever, anything that has schools, seminaries, Bible colleges, universities, whatever, that are religious training institutions, they're the best place for providing a great foundation theologically and apologetically. I think apologetics for 21st century apologetics is super important. And having, I think, to equip leaders to engage in the conversation with people that are asking questions that are being thoughtful about spiritual matters, and just giving them a good theological foundation and apologetics. I mean, it sort of sounds like an obvious thing, but that is a keeper. Like, don't, that needs to stay. That's the best place for that to happen. I think when you think about things that maybe don't belong in a seminary or the seminary needs to stop doing, I would list stuff like they are not the best place. A seminary is not the best place necessarily, I think, for students to learn how to catalyze a disciple-making movement. Because the very nature, if it's a traditional seminary thing, it's almost like a cloistering kind of thing where you pull yourself away for 4 years, if or maybe whatever, a number of years, and you pull yourself out of culture and society. So that's kind of hard to learn how to be fully engaged in disciple making when you're pulling yourself away from the people that you're trying to make disciples of. Startup best practices, organizational dynamics, like business principles, as Brad mentioned. I think the future is going to be much more integration between the marketplace and ministry leadership. And the place to learn the marketplace is from people who have marketplace experience, not theoreticians in a seminary that read a bunch of books, but people that are teaching. So those are, I'd say, the practices that are going to be needed. Many of them are best learned in other places, and so figuring out how to do that well is what needs to happen, in my opinion.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. That's really good. What about in your world, Rob? What's this thing about training ministry leaders that you think this needs to stay? This is important. And what is the thing that you said, no, this can be thrown out?
Yeah. We cannot drop Old Testament. And I think in the parish, we'll always be attracted to the words of Jesus and some quotes from Paul, but like that, grind it out, know your Old Testament, know the biblical story there, so you can understand all the riffs on Genesis and Exodus, the prophets. So I would say you cannot get enough Old Testament in academic settings, because you're just not going to pick up Jeremiah on your own and like read a commentary and like write 4 papers on it. Like, so I would say the Old Testament is something that's really worth digging into in academic settings. And if we could add some, so I'd keep that. In my tradition, there's a lot done with CPE, getting in touch with your own feelings, and I think that actually is important for pastoral leadership. But I kind of wish there was almost like a evangelical, an EPE or something, where you had to do something, you actually had to talk about people who are non-believers about their faith. And probably many people coming into seminary have that experience, but going back to the cloister is good, I think, for digging deep into certain subjects like the Old Testament. You're not going to do that on a weekly to week basis in the parish. But yeah, something where you'd be more engaged in actually sort of taking risks. Academics is always a risk averse thing. So what could be done to kind of push people out of their comfort zone and taking risks for the gospel?
Yeah, yeah, that is so good. I went to Bible college and seminary, never even heard of CPE until I was probably in my mid-30s. Like, oh, I wish I would have done this when I was a little bit younger, because this is really good stuff. So yeah, really good. Thanks, Rob. What about for you, Brad? What is something that you think needs to stay? What is something that you think needs to go?
Well, to stay, obviously, good basic theological education. I think to go, for me, I'd frame it in kind of 2 big rocks. It would be content and delivery. So, and what I mean by content, and Steve alluded to this already, is we just have to expand the type of leaders that we're training that aren't just pastors. We need to think about marketplace leaders and business leaders and more apostolic missionary type of leaders, just that have an interplay with the marketplace and public square and all of that. We just don't, typically we don't help leaders that go to seminary think very well about engaging the context outside the walls of the church. So that would be the content side. The delivery side, I'd say we've got to stop asking leaders to leave their context to attend seminary. It just doesn't make sense anymore. And I did that twice, and it's crazy. If you're really embedded in your local community or neighborhood, to ask ask a leader to uproot and go somewhere for 4 years to incur a bunch of debt and then somehow try to find, go someplace else and embed in that context. I just think for most leaders that doesn't make sense. So now, thank goodness, most seminary education in the country now has some kind of virtual component, which I think is good. But ultimately, I think, I mean, this is going to sound idealistic, but I think ultimately the best theological education needs to be rooted in the local church. And we're seeing more of that with like pipelines and residencies, that are embedded in local churches. I think is a real positive. So yeah, so for me, what needs to go is probably some content and broadening the way we think about the leaders that we're training, and then how are we going to deliver that content?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Brad. And that was a nice alley-oop for the next question, which is, this is me kind of showing some of my stripes, no pun intended. Are the Yankees still losing, by the way? Can someone let me know that? I'm like literally wondering right now as I'm listening. But anyways, and that is that, churches, seminaries, Bible colleges, theological institutions, these are fantastic, but where are disciples made and where are disciples grown? It's the local church. And I can imagine that there's people in this room now, people who are going to watch the recording later. This is how I felt a lot of times in my ministry as well, of like, man, I'd love to have some folks that I was investing in and developing and training up, but man, I don't even know where to start. So all of you in your own ways have invested in the next generation of leaders, whether that was somebody younger, somebody older, someone in the church, someone in the marketplace. What encouragement would you give the pastor listening to this that says, this is all good and fine, but they're winning 4-3 ninth inning. All right.
Yeah.
Thank God. Thanks, Rob. what advice would you give to that pastor who feels like I can't even find a person to develop? Where do I start? So Rob, I know this is your heart. How do you do it, Rob? How do you work your magic as a leader in a church of developing leaders?
I think everybody's called to ministry in their baptism. I don't think Jesus says, well, okay, like, well, you all are going to be in ministry, but like you all, I don't actually expect to be like servants or help other people or share the gospel. So I think we're all called into ministry, and I'd really begin with that. And then I think all of our jobs as ministry is like, some people we want to get off the beach into their ankles, some people we want to get up to their knees, some up to their waist, and some to take the deep dive, and then some to be inviting others to go. So I would sort of look at it like, yes, there is the like talk to the youth who's got gifts to say you should be a leader in the church in your future, right? The Timothys of the world. But I would say the whole leadership development of what are ways in which we're always kind of challenging people to, like, whether it's the asking a 75-year-old woman to lead prayer before a council meeting. Again, the whole system has to be about developing leaders, not so much worried about sort of formal education or not. I think that will come if you start to sort of focus on the whole leadership pipeline.
Yeah, I love that. That's fantastic. Thanks, Rob. Same question for you, Brad, the person who feels like I don't even know where to start. What do you share with them?
Right. Yeah, well, I'd echo a little bit of what Rob just said, that we just got to, we have, I mean, historically, we've looked at potential leaders in the church as those that have pastor teacher potential or skills. I mean, like, I remember when the first church I ever attended, that was it. It was like, the only way I was called to ministry is if I could be a pastor, shepherd, teacher. So I just think we need to look beyond that. We need to look at marketplace leaders and disciple people into their calling beyond being a pastor. So I just think, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I think younger leaders, they don't see that sacred secular divide like many others see. I mean, they want to live lives that are not segregated or bifurcated between work and ministry. They want to live lives that are integrated. So I think we need to look for those kinds of leaders, just people of character, that want to build relationships in their neighborhood and their workplaces and social spaces. And so don't limit yourself to just those that you think are gifted as shepherd teachers that are kind of the, historically the way we think of ministry, but try to expand it out to those that just have more of a, again, kind of apostolic missionary perspective on reaching their neighbors in their neighborhood and engaging their city and that sort of thing. But just expand your vision of what potential ministers would look like.
Yeah, no, you're spot on, man. It's like I think of who Jesus chose to be his disciples, right? That might have not been the first people we would have chosen based on how we often view of what a leader is or
Right.
isn't.
Yeah, could I actually
Please.
you think about Philip and Stephen, right? They were just told to wash tables. And out of that comes the conversion of the start to the African mission and also the first martyr. So again, I think it's that whole, if you get too narrow of a definition, you're not going to get there. But if you take people of character and you invite them in to just taking more responsibility, I think that's when the spirit starts to really do the work.
Amen. Amen. What about for you, Steve, that discouraged pastor who says, I don't even know where to start? What do you tell him?
Yeah, boy, this is such a great, another great question here.
I'm noticing a
I,
theme, Steve. You really like these questions. I'm very
I
flattered.
do, I like them. I think another lens. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said already, but I would add, maybe a real simple place to start is just instead of what we often do is we get desperate and we got to have a leader for this, we got to have a leader for that, and we rush out and try to find people. And so Rob just said that they were asked to wash tables or whatever they were asked to do, just simple stuff. So there's something powerful about just start watching, just start observing, get people involved in doing stuff, not just church stuff, but get people involved in doing things that you can see how they're gifted and how they're anointed. And then a real simple starting place to kind of help distinguish, because I think we're talking about leaders here, and there is a, I think everybody's called to ministry, but not everybody is equipped or gifted to be a leader, and so that doesn't. So there's kind of, this is oversimplifying, but maybe there's doers and developers, and doers are people who are just, they have great hearts and they love Jesus with all their heart, and they're just willing to do whatever. They don't really have a vision for the big picture as much. They just want to serve and be a blessing. And every church needs tons of doers. But then there's developers. There's people who, when they look at other people and they look at tasks that needs to be done, they're automatically already thinking about how can we do this together, and they start. And those are the people that end up being, the simple task of a leader is to get people from here to there. And so when you see people who are able to get other people from here to there, those people have potential as leaders. So what I would say is, first of all, just sort of, number one, observe people. Number two, try to identify the people who might be developers. When you see a developer, then start hanging out with them, then start, spending time with them, and let them be with you as you do whatever it is you do. And of course, then you've got to model what that means. So it means more, sure, they can help you maybe prepare a sermon or, put the chairs in order or whatever, but maybe that also means you take them with you when you invite your neighbors over for a meal, just to have a meal and show them what it looks like to begin making disciples of your neighbors and stuff like that. And so when you pour time and effort into a developer, that gets multiplied out because they're going to influence other people. And so I think the key, so it's watch, it's identify the people who have that leadership potential, and then it's be with them. And spiritual leadership is more caught than taught. So, invite them into your life and let them watch what you're doing. And of course, that calls me to a higher standard of, the fact that what I'm doing is going to get replicated. So I want to do it in a way that honors Jesus and is helpful for people. So those are some of my, so again, going back to the challenge you presented is like, man, where do I get people from? Well, just start watching the people you have and see what's already there. And I think in most churches, there's already everything that's needed. We just don't always see it.
Wow. Yeah. In most churches, there's everything we already need. We don't always see it. Man, that was worth the price of admission right there. Thanks, Steve. Love that. All right. So this is Covo Con. So of course, I have to talk some Covo, Bivo, tent making, whatever the language is for it. Basically, having more than one job, being in ministry, but that not being the only thing you do. Let's start off with you, Brad. How do you see that fitting into the next generation of church leaders? I think you're on mute, brother. You're good.
Sorry. Well, I think it's just absolute key. I mean, anytime I have the opportunity to talk about Bible Covo church planning, a lot of times people will say, "Oh yeah, I think this is the future," and I want to say, no, it's actually the present. Like, I think we're already behind the 8 ball if we're not really engaging in bivocational and covocational church planting and pastoring. And frankly, and this is my personal bias, but I think it's the single best missiological and financial strategy for planting a church. Like there, and I'm a big both and. This isn't either or, but unfortunately, I think in a lot of contexts, especially in the last 50 years with lots of church growth movement mentality, it's been an either or, and it's been launch large, raise a bunch of money, and try to be full time as quickly as possible. And I think in an increasing missionary context that all of us are now currently living, that's just not a very good strategy. I just think there are so many missiological benefits and so many financial benefits of being bivocational or covocational. It's not just the future. I think it's the present. So, and once again, as I mentioned earlier, younger generation, it's just natural for them to have side hustles. It's natural for them to think about being bivocational or covocational. So I think it's absolutely crucial component of the future of church planting in North America.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. Same question for you, Steve. What are your views on Bivo, Covo, tent making?
Well, first of all, I'm Bivo because in addition to the two nonprofits that I give leadership to, I also work for a company that's a for-profit company called the Answer Group. And we do consulting for businesses like Caterpillar and United Airlines and groups like that. And so we end up in the boardrooms with some of the middle, a lot of times it's with the middle management of some of the bigger companies and sometimes the top management. And it's just an incredible, the company is actually all believers that are the consultants. And so we're believers in the marketplace in a consulting position, and we have all these amazing conversations. So anyway, I'm just saying, number one, I'm living that already. I agree with Brad. It isn't the future, it's now. But here's what I really believe is happening. I see this big trend. I think 25 years from now, people that are in ministry roles are going to be surprised to learn that for 100 years or so, the primary way that church leaders were supported was through the tithes and offerings of people in the congregation. I think that's going to be such a strange concept for people. What has become normal for us is actually really abnormal. If you look at the history of the church over the 2 millennium, the idea of the church being the sole provider for the pastor was actually not normative. And so I think that we're in the midst of a big shift, and 25 years from now, it's going to be shocking to people that we ever thought the way we do now. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Appreciate that. What about you, Rob? What are you seeing in your world when it comes to tent making, ministry, and then also the Acts 1, Acts 6 comparison? I'd love to hear more on that as well.
Oh man, Steve just said a lot there at the end about like macro changes and how money works in society. And so I'll just say real briefly that the Reformation also coincides with the rise of the middle class, that they no longer had to depend on like civic leaders. And so the Augsburg Confession, which is sort of, you could sort of say the formal beginnings of the sort of academic Protestant Reformation, is actually signed entirely by merchants. It's not by priests, it's by merchants and low nobles. And it's so again, the rise of the middle class. And also if you think about like the fall of the Roman Empire and the lack of stability there is what gives rise to the monastic movement. So the church sort of views it missiologically, but a lot was actually driven by money. But okay, so that's like another topic that I could go on and on about. But I'll just say that right now what you have within, I think economically, the pastoral sized church, like 75 to 150 people a Sunday, I think is no longer a viable model with modern healthcare costs. And so those people that are doing it likely are getting their spouse's health insurance or have really large endowments at their churches. So I think you're sort of pushing them towards micro expressions of the church where bivocational is just how it's going to have to be, or macro expressions where you're still going to have specialization. But I think that but I think even within those larger systems, if they're actually wanting to do the mission work now, because basically those large churches have become the denominations of the 21st century, like they're going to need people, they're going to be doing the deploying. And I think a lot of them are just going to have to start experimenting. Because what you see happening right now in the church is just a consolidation of people into a smaller number of churches. But eventually the biggest churches are going to have to wake up and be like, oh, we can't just attract people. We actually have to do like the long, slow work of making disciples. This isn't as much fun. And like when they get to that point, they're actually going to have to do like small, more agile movements. And then they're going to have to go back and hire a lot of, BIVO people. But I realized I just gave like a dissertation there in about 2.5 minutes. So that might be something we need to unpack a little bit later. Short summary, big money changes in history shape how the church can do mission. And the second thing is that right now, money is no longer working towards a pastoral sized church. You're moving towards micro and macro expressions. Micro is going to be where bivocational takes place necessarily. And the macro, when they actually get to the point where they actually stop eating each other and actually have to create like disciples again, they will need to hire bivocational people.
All right, mic drop moment there. Let's go.
I haven't even
Eating
done
each
Acts
other.
1 and Acts 8 yet. I'm
Yeah,
ready for Acts 1 and Acts 8.
Go ahead,
That's
Robert.
exciting.
It's all you. No, you want to do it now? Go ahead.
Okay. So here's the thing. So I joke that the church in Acts 1 is First Lutheran Church of Jerusalem. Okay. Because, check this out. They have the best location, right? The upper room. And they have the best people, like over half the New Testament, 2/3 of the New Testament is in that room. And they're doing the most churchy stuff possible. They're literally praying prayers with each other as they grieve and process the resurrection. So you got the right people in the right place doing the right things. And what do they decide to do? Okay, like literally the best people in the world, what they decide to do is to fill a committee spot with a number 12 person because that is the number of righteousness. They literally had to fill a committee spot. And then the best part is, you know what criteria they use? The criteria that they use in Acts 1 is that he's been here since the beginning. They literally want somebody who's been around, who hasn't done, there's no other characteristic than he's one of us who's been around, okay? When they do that, that guy is never heard of again. Not once. Acts 6, they have a second chance. They say, you know what? Let's pick people of character who seem to be wise. And they pick a very diverse group of people who clearly weren't there from the beginning, as the names show. So they pick a diverse group of people that actually have not in common the same sort of like sort of residential or sort of experience, but actually have the spirit. And then those are the people who again become the start to add another continent and the first martyr of the church.
Wow.
Wow, I never heard it. I would never read Acts 1 the same ever again.
Dude, it's
So-
First Lutheran Church of Jerusalem.
I never made that connection until now. This guy has done nothing. Let's bring him on in. Yep. Well said. Well said. We have 2 more questions. I'll open the floor to whoever wants to ask the panelists questions, and I'm looking forward to that portion. Sorry, Brad, I'm gonna go back to your earlier story because it kind of relates. So someone comes to you as a pastor, as a ministry leader, says, I really feel a call to ministry. And they have a traditional marketplace background. They work at a company, they are a school teacher, they drive a school bus, or like Brad, like they own a restaurant. Like, what do you tell that person? They sort of feel like, I'm called by God to be in ministry. I have a traditional secular work background. Like, what should I do? Steve, what do you tell this person?
I would tell them to invite three neighbors or friends into their life and help them follow Jesus and teach them to do the same thing, and see what happens. And if they have a ministry calling, then they're gonna do that well. They're gonna make disciples who make disciples. But simultaneously, I'd also encourage them to figure out a way to get some theological training, some theological foundation, some apologetics foundation. Preferably, again, like Brad said, please don't go away. Get it here, which again is much more accessible than it ever used to be. And once they've made disciples to the 3rd generation, then they might be genuinely called into some kind of ministry leadership role. But I think that's a qualification that I want to see. And that's how I'm going to figure out, like, help them decide if they're called or not. It's not just about, can you get up and preach a sermon, or can you do all this stuff right? But actually, can you do what Jesus said to do and make disciples? And if they can do that, then maybe they're a ministry leader.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. Rob, same question. Marketplace leader comes to you, says, I feel like God's calling me into ministry. What's that process look like in your world?
You know what? I just want to process what Steve said. I'm just blown away by Steve's answer, because Steve's answer was not protecting the institution. That I just really, I'm repenting of my answer because of your answer. So I'm just going to leave that there.
Oh,
All right. All right. Love to hear real-time learning happening. Fantastic. What about you, Brad?
Well, I think I could kind of go back and think about my story. I think first thing is I would try to help them diminish the sacred secular divide, because too often
yeah.
I think when someone's in the marketplace and they feel a call to ministry, they feel like they
Mm.
need to leave the marketplace to focus on ministry. And I'd want to help them see, echoing what Steve said, how does their calling in the marketplace contribute to and participate in the mission of God? Like, help them
Yeah.
see the common good that their marketplace calling brings. That'd be the first thing, is just help them like cool their jets a bit if they feel like they like need to leave it to somehow focus on ministry, and see, no, they're in ministry, and then help them, you know, bring alignment to those things. But then also, like as Steve said, if they're really interested in theological education, then I would encourage them to try to find some kind of online virtual way to do that, to receive theological education. And then again, mentioned this earlier, I think this is more prevalent today than ever before, but I would encourage them to try to find some church-based residency where they would get ministry training. And for goodness sake, yeah, please do not uproot your family, sell everything, and, you know, travel halfway across the country, but try to find other ways to get some really good, robust theological education in their current context.
Yeah, yeah. I hope
Here-
I hope no seminary president watches this. That's all I was going to say. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I don't know if everybody's heard this before. I don't know who said it. It's one of those things. Somebody else said it, and I've repeated it enough that now I think maybe I thought of it, but I know somebody else thought of it. And is the divide is not sacred and secular; it's sacred and sinful. And I think we need to help people, realize that if you're a follower of Jesus, the Holy Spirit is in your life, and basically whatever you do is sacred, whether it's at the church building or it's in the marketplace, running a business or teaching a class or whatever you do. That's a sacred act because Jesus is working through you. And once people get that, and it really unlocks, but unless it's sinful. I mean, again, once you become involved in sin, that's the thing to be concerned about, is not, oh no, I'm going out among the unwashed heathens, no, you're bringing the presence of Jesus where it's needed the most. And so there is no sacred and secular. It's sacred and sinful is the divide we need to be concerned about.
And a little tweak on that, Steve, it's Parker Palmer. I love, he says there's no sacred and secular, it's sacred and desecrated. So it's like we bring the sacred into the desecrated. That's a Parker Palmer quote that I use often.
Awesome.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. All right, so I want to end on a high note, because if you read the stats, it's pretty depressing. I was talking to Steve about this last week, actually, how I was feeling this kind of inner reckoning, because I'm a former church planter. I'm about a year and a half post church planting, and lots of amazing things God has done through church planting and through ministry in the last 25 years in America. But in the last 25 years, 40 million less Americans go to church. So in my quiet moments in my house in suburban Lancaster, I'm in the backyard thinking about, my ministry and my life. I think, wow, that stinks. I feel like this is like we're not winning this battle, so as it were. So what is something encouraging, hopeful, that you want to leave people with, who feel like, man, I really want to see disciples made. I really want to see the communities transformed. I really want to see marriages healed. I really want to see the church flourish. What word would you leave us with to just encourage us as we, get to the halfway point of this Covo Con? Then we'll open the floor for for the guest here. But whoever wants to go first, what encouraging word would you share with us? from the panelists?
Well, I'll start. I would say I am most encouraged by the alternative expressions of church that I see all over the country. I mean, just leaders that are starting businesses, mission, birthing churches out of the starting a business, explosion of nonprofits that are just doing amazing work, and then just lots of leaders, especially church planters, that are just planting alternative expressions of church that are getting into the nooks and crannies of our cities and communities. So yeah, it can be discouraging to kind of look at, the really just about any indicator we look at to judge church health and church growth are trending in the wrong direction. But there's this movement of leaders that are starting new, fresh expressions that I just find very exciting.
Love that. Thanks, Brad.
Steve, do you want to go?
Sure. I'm very encouraged about the future because I'm seeing there's a trending away from just as they call it, the prevailing model, which unfortunately done right can only be executed by exceptionally gifted individuals who maybe have a pristine background as Christians. Their pedigree is just amazing, and so those are just a rare breed that can really pull off kind of the prevailing model of church that everybody has been kind of taught to think this is the way the church is supposed to be. And so what I'm seeing happen is exactly what Brad talked about, is there's just an increasing number of people who don't fit. They're wired completely different. They wouldn't be able to do the prevailing model because it just doesn't fit them. But there's a place for them. They're making a place for them, and I'm seeing it happen in front of my eyes. I'm actually leading this. I've started helping organizations find those people in the pews that nobody has ever thought about could be a church leader. We do these things called a discovery cohort, and we walk people through a process of just discovering how God's wired them and put them together. And recently I had a cohort, and there was a young lady that was in the cohort, and as she was going through the process, her story was fascinating. She had been kind of the kingpin of a drug dealing organization in her community, ended up in prison, and in prison, she found Jesus. And she got out of prison. And in order to be in this cohort, you have to be recommended by your pastor. It has to be, so the pastor has to say, I think this is a person of character and quality. So she's in this group. And so as I'm listening to her competencies as a drug lord in her community, I realized, this person is a church planter. They could be a church planter, they might be a church planter, and so what I'm seeing is there's an intentionality start to emerge where people are looking past just the superstars and realizing, wow, our pews, our church bodies, our church families are loaded with people with potential, and we just really need to be about finding the people and helping activate them into the ministry that God's called them to do. So I see a pivot happening, and this Covo Con conversation that we're having right now is one evidence of that. The discovery cohorts are another evidence of that. I just see lots of evidence all over the place. I'm working with, urban churches. You can't do a prevailing model church in an urban place. So I see all kinds of amazing creativity happening. So I just think right now we're in this, the trend is down. All the things are saying, things are going in the wrong direction. But again, with Brad, I feel like there's this surge coming. I was just at the beach for a wedding last week, and I watched those waves coming in, and it looks like everything's really flat, and then all of a sudden this big old wave just emerges because there's something going on under the surface. And I think there's something going on under the surface, and there's a big wave going to wash in that, and it's being brought by God. So, but we can be part of it. We can cooperate with them. That's what we got to do.
Awesome. What about for you, Rob? How would you encourage us this evening?
Yeah, so Luther has a quote, and he said, God's kingdom comes whether we pray for it or not. We pray in this prayer, the Lord's Prayer, that it might come among us. And God's kingdom isn't going anywhere. And maybe a story that to me is always really encouraging is there were two monks that were missionaries. Their names were Cyril and Methodius. And they were sent to the Moravian people And they were doing missionary work, and Cyril was a linguistic genius and came up with an alphabet for the people there and actually translated all of the liturgies into their language. But then there was a meeting between the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople, and they decided that the Moravian territory would now be a Latinized Western sort of missionary outpost. And so Cyril and Methodius had to literally pack up their bags after they'd done all this missionary work, and they translated all this stuff into the Slavic language, and they just had to pick up and move. Within a few years, Cyril would die. And you think about, he spent his whole life doing all this, and he's like, what was it for? Well, he could not have known that in the next millennia and a half, next millennia, over 1 billion people would read the scriptures in the alphabet that he invented. He had no idea. And so I think in our world, like, we can't worry about how this is all going to be put together by God into some renewal. The renewal of the American, it might take God another 50 years to clean out the mess that's happened in the American church with the politicalization of it. It might literally take another 100 years. It might take 200. It doesn't matter. Our job is to just be faithful and do what we're called to do, and let God sort out the chips how God wants to.
Amen. Amen. Well said. Well said. Can we show our appreciation to these guys for answering these questions? And we're going to pivot here in a moment to open the floor for you. So if you have a question kind of burning in your brain, we'll take those in a second. I'm going to hit the pause button on here.